These are not from a book.
If ever there were a time for a candle in the darkness, this would be it. Using the spark of hope, kindle the flame of love, ignite the light of peace, and feed the flame of justice. And this is from Melanie Davis. You're welcome.
We have any joys and concerns for today? I can start us off here. I have a concern about Omicron and that our hospitals are full. My physical therapist told me they have to go work in the hospital because there's so short staff. So,
Oh, geez. We have a concern for Gabe, who is not feeling well, not COVID, but not feeling well, and that's why they are not attending today.
I'm sorry, I missed you.
Gabe?
Hi, yes, I'm here.
Jacob has a joy for having time for an afternoon date yesterday with his wife. Yay, you stay married another year.
Who is that, Carla?
I don't know. We better find out.
Here, I'll do it. A joy.
Jacob's a good one, Rick.
This is a joy for our son who surprised me and told me he was trying out for the play and got a small part in it.
Awesome.
We got a joy if you do get the arrangements made to move the piano. I don't play. I have always wanted to learn, so that's something that'll have to wait until after seminary. But also we got a dining room that's about almost as big as this combined room.
Wow.
And we envision, potlucks and, if someone shows up that plays, it's a really nice.
Just saying.
How far away is it?
That's in Shawnee.
Oh, so it's.
No, she says something.
Oh,
the
yeah.
piano. Is it?
It's in our list.
Arlington.
Almost.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I've enjoyed. I mean, this has been a nice little break conversation before the service started. And, I just think that's worth commenting on. It's nice to see some people that, Marty and I only opportunity to chat with them. I don't know, just feels lively.
Now, a joy for just being able to rediscover jazz music, to have a little more time and a little better equipment to go back to vinyl and listen to that. Nice. Just here's so much more detail in it, and to, among other things, cover learn more about Joe Hendrickson, who is a Lima native, or who was a Lima native, and an amazing saxophone player who played with everyone.
Wouldn't it be fun to be able to talk about that with Paul?
I know.
Wouldn't that have been special?
Yeah, well, I thought about doing something for the both of them, so yeah.
I'm following the right thing. I haven't done this in a while.
You're doing good.
Next up is our offertory, and I'm going to read a passage from a book. I was originally going to play a song, but I thought this should just be all about books. Just love books. Just a reminder, I'm going to pass this around for those of you online. You can always give via Facebook. I think there's a link to our PayPal.
And in the newsletter.
So I'm going to let that go around. And I'm going to read the very beginning of this book. So this is stamped Racism, Anti-Racism and You by Ibram Kendi and Jason Reynolds. Kendi wrote Stamped from the Beginning, which is a history of racism, and that was a book for adults. But then he teamed up with Jason Reynolds. If you don't know who he is just an awesome person. He writes books for children and young adults, and I love on his website it says his goal is to not write boring books. And I saw an interview with him, and he said, "My goal is to write books for kids like me. So I wanted to write books that kids would be interested in." And so I'm just going to read you the first few, the very beginning of this book, which I think is great. And you can totally hear Jason Reynolds' voice in here, and then also I think Ibram Kendi, he's an academic. He also wrote How to Be an Anti-Racist, which is, I have read that one. Stand from the beginning. I'm still trying to get through it. It's more academic. So here we go. This is called Chapter 1, The Story of the World's First Races. Before we begin, let's get something straight. This is not a history book. I repeat, this is not a history book. At least not like the ones you're used to reading in school. The ones that feel more like a list of dates. There will be some, with an occasional war here and there, a declaration. Definitely got to mention that. A constitution, that too. A court case or two. And of course, the paragraph that's read during Black History Month. Period! Exclamation point. Rosa! Exclamation point. Martin! Exclamation point. This isn't that. This isn't a history book, or at least it's not that kind of history book. Instead, what this is a book that contains history. A history directly connected to our lives as we live them right this minute. This is a present book. A book about the here and now. A book that hopefully will help us better understand why we are where we are as Americans, specifically as our identity pertains to race. Uh-oh, the R word, which for many of us still feels rated R, or can be matched only with another R word, run. But don't. Let's all take a deep breath. Inhale, hold it, exhale, and breathe out. Great. Get the taste of that. Ooh, yeah. All right. So like I said before, I am not going to do justice to this topic because it is huge. And as most of you know, I'm a librarian, so I'm not going to say I live and breathe this stuff all day because I work in an academic library, which I feel like gives us more freedom than someone that may work in a public or school library. And you'll see that throughout this presentation. And there will be times in here for us to discuss and talk. And I left a bunch of time at the end because I think people have lots of things that they want to talk about. So that, Pamela, can you bring up my shot? Sure. If you go to the second slide. Okay. So for the teachers in the room, this is how I always set things up. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you about. So we're going to start out talking kind of about the big ideas. So intellectual freedom, censorship, library values. Then we'll talk about kind of the nuts and bolts, what happens when a book gets challenged in a library. I threw in some stuff here because I think there's this belief in certain professions that you're perfect because you are that profession. So I wanted to talk about some of the not so great things. So I'm going to talk about self-censorship and neutrality, and then I'm going to end with what's happening now. Here we go. So I will tell you, I've been a bad librarian and have not made a slide of resources. Every good librarian should have made a slide of resources. Almost all this information is taken from the American Library Association website. There is a slew of stuff. So if you're interested in learning more about this after this presentation, which I hope you are, that's where you should go. So what's the information? So I'm going to start off talking about intellectual freedom. I'm just going to read this slide because I think this is a really great definition. So intellectual freedom is the right of every individual to both seek and receive information from all points of view without restriction. It provides for free access to all expressions of ideas through which any and all sides of the question, cause, or movement may be explored. So I love American Library Association said, these are like the foundations of our democracy, right? We are lucky most of the time to live in the United States in that we can have an exchange of information freely without anyone interfering with that conversation. So on the flip side is censorship. So censorship is a suppression of ideas and information that certain persons, could be individuals, groups, government officials, find objectionable or dangerous. And I always think of China when I think of censorship because they have heavy control over information in that country. Actually was able to go to an international conference here in Columbus, and they had a Chinese librarian presenting. And I was like, what is this weird social media she's talking about? Well, they don't have Twitter. I'm going to forget the name of their Twitter, but it is government
Weibo.
Weibo. It is government controlled. So if someone pops something up there and the government's like, I don't like that, it is immediately taken off of there, which just was crazy to me. Right?
Wow.
Yeah. Censorship. We're gonna. Yeah. So then, I wanted to share with you the Library Bill of Rights. This is not the whole Library Bill of Rights. I just picked out 3 of the tenets that I thought were most relevant to this discussion today. There's other ones on there like providing access to everyone to information. If you want to look at the Library Bill of Rights later, you can do that. So these are the 3 I thought are most relevant. I can't read it. So that first one says books and other library resources should be provided for the interest, information, and enlightenment of all people in the community the library serves. Materials should not be excluded because of the origin, background, or views of those contributing to their creation. So this one I always like, it talks about the part I always focus on, pointing out that you should be serving your whole community, right? So like a public library, I think they have that cool mission of serving patrons from birth to death, right? So we need to have a children's collection, we need to have stuff for young adults, and we also need to have stuff for, adults and people getting older, right? So they have a really cool mission. And I also think of like, you need to look at who's in your community. A lot of young families, so I need to provide books about parenting. Do I have people that are not English speakers? Do I need to provide books that are of different languages? Number 2, libraries should provide materials and information presenting all points of view on current and historical issues. Materials should not be prescribed or removed because of partisan or doctrinal disapproval. And this is, we're going to talk about this when I come to neutrality. This is the one where sometimes I have some struggles with. But this one I'll just give an example of for doctrinal disapproval. I might come in, I'm very religious, and I feel like, oh, these other materials about Islam or Judaism shouldn't be in the library. But if they are people in the community, right, they represent those religions, those materials should be there. And then finally, this last one is pretty simple. Libraries should challenge censorship in the fulfillment of their responsibility to provide information in life. So I feel like that. All right. Here's where you get to help me out. So who challenges books? Any examples?
Could I ask a question, Kathleen?
Parents challenge children.
Yes. Lawmakers.
Lawmakers.
There's a guy in Texas right now that I'm learning about.
We reviewed that list the other day at work. It was
His
interesting. His list.
Just to see, or did you have to?
One of my colleagues had that list and they just shared it. It was just interesting to see what was on there. Even I don't know, some of the objections were interesting to me. Stuff like, this book is too sad. I was like, that's
He didn't want white teenagers to be uncomfortable or to feel shame.
Yeah, but I felt like some of them were like a real stretch. Like,
Yeah.
you know that book, Why Mosquitoes Buzz in Your Ears? Anyone know that book? Yeah, and I couldn't figure out, like, I just felt like any book they found not written by a white person was thrown on that list. Yes.
Do school boards as a unit ever challenge school boards?
I haven't heard, I mean, I'm not an expert in this, but it's very possible a school board could.
Day and age.
Yeah. Well, I know they've got political stuff. So I was on at one time a library selection committee, and that the challenge is you've got a lot of books on the buy so many. People are sending samples. And you gotta select from these samples. So it was a fall. It was a grade school library. And so it's reading all of these children's books. But, you know, you had to make some kind of decision. And people would say, are you involved in censorship? It's like, no, it's not. It's selection.
Which I'll talk about later. Anyone else want to add something to that? So the top challengers, according to the American Library Association, are parents. That's surprising.
Wow.
Yeah. Next slide.
Yes. At least I think I can. No.
Right. So these are the top 3 reasons for challenging books, again, according to American Library Association. So one, sexually explicit materials, or what the challenger thinks of as sexually explicit, right? It doesn't, our definitions could be different. 2, offensive language. 3, I found weird. I'm not sure what this one meant. Unsuited for any age group. I wasn't quite sure what they meant by that. And I thought, if anyone else had other reasons you think people challenge books. I think there's some new reasons that have popped up this year.
Race, I mean,
Yes.
it seems like that's become.
Any book about race, I feel like, has been a target this year.
Any book that is critical of how race has been handled in this country because it's seen as unpatriotic.
Even, you know, any book that's critical of any aspect of American history in this country is likely to be challenged by some.
I would think science might be, you know, certain scientific things like, oh,
Evolution.
yeah, when the dinosaurs split. Who made it on the ark? Yeah.
Right. Anything that challenges somebody's picture of the world. There's going to be somebody that challenges that. But unsuited for any age group, I would think, you know, that there's a lot of overlap there, right? I mean, your ethical framework says only these ideas are okay. Then anything that's outside of these ideas is unsuitable for everybody.
Yes.
Anything dealing with sexual orientation or gender identity?
Yeah, which I think is maybe that sexually explicit is anything that's not a heterosexual relationship. Maybe sometimes people object to.
But I mean, George is about a 6 or 7-year-old child.
Transgender girl.
Yeah. And with no sexually explicit material.
No, I mean, I'm just saying that may be the reason they said it was, but it may not actually be sexually explicit.
Okay,
Does that
so
make
these
sense?
are the arguments claimed.
Yes.
Okay.
Claimed by challengers.
Many of the books that I'm reading in seminary, really, because they are books that challenge the traditional view.
Is my thing acting out?
No, your thing isn't acting out. I'm for some reason having a hard time showing it to the people at home. It's not advancing. Sorry. You guys keep talking and we go.
Okay, so I'm just going to move on. I'm on the one side. What do libraries do when faced with a challenge? So this is kind of the nuts and bolts. Now I'm on the slide that says PROT, which means nothing. I just like the graphic. So this is kind of the process. So most libraries have a policy. So my library has a policy. I'm sure a public library has a policy. If someone comes in all angry, like, I can't believe that my child read this book, there's a policy and a process that needs to be followed. That's called the reconsideration process. So usually that involves the challenger filling out a form, asking questions like, what is the book? What is your objection? Did you actually read the book? You'll be surprised to know a lot of people haven't necessarily read the book, but they're objecting to it. And so that's what's going to happen. And then the library usually has some kind of committee to review that challenge. So it'll be different depending on what kind of library it is. So, for example, the public library is probably going to have to involve the board, the director, a school, again, it's probably going to have to involve the school board, some kind of administrator, hopefully the librarian, and some teachers. And then what they're going to do is look at their collection policy. So this is where I'm going to tell you, librarians do not buy books willy-nilly. They have a collection policy written up that tells them, like, this is what we're trying to do in our library. So I can speak to what I do in my library. So we're serving a bunch of students, right? And we're supporting the research in the curriculum. So I'm not going to buy books about something non-controversial, about anthropology, because we don't have an anthropology program at our institution, right? So it helps kind of give guidelines. And some institutions have very, very specific guidelines. Some are wider, but I'm sure Lima Public Library, the same, has some guidelines about what they will or will not buy. So then that committee decides, like, they have a bunch of options. So they may decide, this book belongs in the young adult section. We're going to move it to the adult section. Or they'll just decide this book is fine where it is. They make a decision to put it behind the desk. That's not one of my favorites. But sometimes that helps appease members of the community, but it still allows the library to keep that book.
Does that mean you don't give it out unless people ask for it?
Yes, that's why I don't like it. Because then, that's a barrier to actually getting access to it, right?
Right.
There's sometimes some books that you might feel embarrassed to come to the desk to ask for it.
I didn't even know that libraries did that.
We try not to do it.
Okay.
But that might be one of the options. If this is an appeal, you could have a public hearing. And then it's interesting, the American Library Association really counseled the library to work with media.
Yes.
And that was interesting, to get kind of their side of the situation. And then the last thing here I put, the process could just be forwarded, which really is a bummer, right? So you may have a policy, but the library director or the principal may be like, I'm not dealing with this. Let's just review this one, right?
Comment and the question. First, prop seems like it could be a good British put down. Not like if a crash and someone else had a child, it would be a prop. But the second one is, sorry, you mentioned earlier that libraries should select materials that represent the demographics of the community. But is there policy for representing the demographics beyond their community? I mean, if you live in a very richly homogenous community, how do you learn about people? So what do you define as community? Is it local? Is it rural, national? Is it global? What's defined that?
This is a good question, so I'll just answer it from my own base. I work at a school that's predominantly white students, but we want our students, because they're eventually going to leave this small rural area, to understand what the wide world is about. So we try to be very inclusive and kind of take a worldwide view, right, of the materials that we're collecting. And I can't speak for any other places. They may have that kind of policy at Lima Public Library. I just don't know because I work there, right? And same for school libraries, right? They might want their students to see, like, what are the options of, besides this really small community, how do people live in other parts of the world, right?
You also mentioned earlier, like, that all points of view should be fairly.
No, we're gonna come back to this
What?
one.
Okay, what about the Proud Boys? Or, are you given space? That material.
We're gonna come back to this conversation. This one is a trickier one.
I can figure this out, I think, maybe.
I feel like like the lawyer should answer this one because I don't really know much about this. But there are materials that are illegal to be held and would meet what is called Miller's Law. So I am not a lawyer and I don't know much about obscenity. And it has to meet basically 3 points. I guess that the lawyer could probably answer this better than I could.
I can handle the obscenity.
Mary, give the examples.
There's also different laws that apply to minors of obscenity. I guess the one I think of that is just plain illegal to be held is any child pornography. It's just illegal to be held by anyone. So, but in general, it's a fairly small material. All right, here's our more. We have a couple of harder areas. So we talked earlier about censorship, but there's also this idea of self-censorship. I just wanted to bring up because librarians aren't perfect, right? So I might be in a really conservative community that isn't really accepting, and I might decide I'm not going to buy George because I don't want the headache that's going to bring me in the library, right? And this isn't something that's talked about much, and you would never know that I made that decision not to buy George because I thought it might bring problems to me. But I think people make these decisions because they don't want to deal with the mess it's going to bring, which is unfortunate. All right, I told you to talk about neutrality. So this is something I struggle with. I think my profession as a whole is currently struggling with this idea of neutrality. So in the beginning, like you said, Marty, we're supposed to be providing materials from, and every time I say both sides now, all I can think of is our ex-president when he said, there are good people on both sides after Charlottesville. And so that's where I find myself having that struggle. I put up here a quote from a librarian who's giving a presentation. He said, here, simply put, colleagues, we can't be neutral on social and political issues that impact our customers because, as a Black man, to be frank, these social and political issues impact us as well. So in libraries, there's this idea of we should always be neutral on topics. And a lot of people are starting to push back. Are we ever actually neutral? And were we ever neutral? So the example for that I would give is, libraries, people think everyone can come to the library. Well, no. At one point, libraries did not welcome everyone into the library, right? So if you were of a certain race, sometimes women weren't allowed in libraries, right? So this idea of neutrality is not actually an ideal that we ever held, if that makes any sense. And I don't know how much else to say other than I find it hard. How am I supposed to present both sides if one side is not utilizing facts, right? So in my role at an academic library, it's easier to say, like, I'm not going to buy something a Fox News commentator made because it is not academic, it's not peer reviewed. I can't find anything to back up the claims they're making here. I think it gets trickier when you're in the public library, right? Because you're supposed to be providing materials for your community, right? And not necessarily because you're trying to teach them in an academic setting. I don't know if someone wants to make any comments about that one. Yeah.
I was just wondering if there was, because an individual may be unaware of their biases, are there, does American Library Association or other organizations have, I hate to use the word committee in any conversation about deciding information, but are there groups that are, diverse and representative of multiple cultures that can come together and help make some recommendations on those things?
I think that we're struggling as a profession. We're not diverse enough, and that's been a real issue on a number of things. I wish we had. There are some small pockets of groups. So there's like a Black Libraries Association, Asian American, Native American, Hispanic, right? But they're more like affinity groups. If that makes any sense. Yeah. Not groups to provide policy to the whole organization.
But still meanwhile, like I'm in whispering.
We have a couple of comments from Gabe said the librarian in the small Texas town I used to live in was very political and socially conservative. I remember trying to discuss the need for the library to provide materials on sex education, and she said, when I was your age, we didn't need sex education. And Jacob said, also being neutral doesn't mean giving equal weight to all views. For example, opinions that are not supported by science should not be given as much space as scientifically sound sources. And I guess I'm wondering, like, does it also play a part in how you classify the materials as librarians? Or do you get to classify? Like, when something comes out that's not necessarily sound fact, but maybe your community would want to read it, is it appropriate to place it like in opinions, you know, as opposed to over where the scholarly journals are or whatever?
I wish opinions was a section.
And I was gonna say, why is it an opinion
It's
section?
actually
There's a
not a-
newspaper, why not a library?
Classification. I understand what you're saying. So one of the things I went to look to see is, I forget the, Hitler wrote his own autobiography, and so I was curious to see if we had it. So I'm with you there. It's hard for me to provide context when I just throw a book on the shelf, right? But like,
Right.
that is a material I think is important to have for historical context. I'm in no way endorsing that material,
Right.
right? Unfortunately, it's not. It's a good idea though.
That's very good.
So the issue for me, and I recognize what a struggle it would be, is treating all ideas as equal. False equivalency, the same thing journalists are struggling with in presenting the news. I'd be interested in that.
And also, I just want to say thank you to Gabe. That's a perfect example of someone that is not neutral. They have a ton of biases.
Right.
And I'll be honest with you, I try not to pass on my biases to students when I'm working. I had a student that wanted to write a paper about how great the coal industry was. So I didn't take a neutral ground. He said, I can't find anything. And I told him, well, that's because coal is a non-renewable resource. So the research is saying that is only on renewable resources. I didn't convince him. It was a good attempt.
But I think that we have the idea that the word neutrality means something, but I don't think we know what it means. So I think that's a real problem too, right? And in the conversation that we've had, so far about it, we've kind of looked at it in terms of a balance point between two opposing views, but it's kind of a balancing act between a lot of dimensions, right? And neutral with respect to what? I mean, with respect to the idea that all information is, that it's flat, like that everything, even if you could shake out everything that isn't true, is everything equally important? Or do and clearly not. So we got structures of society that this all exists in reference to, and value judgments have to be made. We have structures in society because value judgments have been made. So I don't know how you could really. I think we need to rethink neutrality, as a concept. Maybe aim for, what principles are we trying to uphold, which you have spoken to a lot of, and there's always a dynamic tension. Any two principles, and I'll give you a scenario where you have to sacrifice one to uphold the other.
Yeah, I guess the tension for me is I don't want to give up the conversation, right? So how can I continue to have a conversation, but not be harming members of my community by providing harmful materials? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So I thought I would end. Here with kind of where we are right now, and there's definitely been an uptick in challenges this past year, according to the American Library Association. Since June, there have been 150 challenges, and those are just the ones that get reported to them.
Right.
And the next slide just shows. Talked about this before. No, it'll go.
Oh, it will.
Say it again.
Oh, there you go. Thank you.
These are the top subjects that have been challenged, or books with the books contain. So I don't think this would be any surprise to any of you. So materials on LGBTQ issues. I'm looking at my gate to George today, but George is a wonderful book about a transgender girl. Books by Black authors that focus on the Black experience. So that's racism, and any books that focus on the experience of BIPOC people. This is at the top.
I'm sorry, what is one book?
Black, Indigenous
People of color.
Yeah, okay.
Jacob was wondering how much of an increase is that number, the
I would
155?
have to go back and compare it
Okay.
to the year
So
before.
it's a question to be answered at a later time. No pressure.
And then that's the end of what I have to say today. I tried to cover a lot of stuff in a little bit of time. And I will say one thing, putting this presentation together made me realize is how much I love books. So I hope I hope that you come away wanting to read something again. Like I started to reread To Kill a Mockingbird, and I forgot about how much I love Scout, who is just a wonderful character. And then I'm thinking maybe I could read this book and it'll help me read the more adult version. And then I've already
That's a
read
good idea.
George. George is a wonderful book about a trans. And then I'm open to more comments, questions. You have something you want to share your favorite book.
So we had a little community library box in front of our house in Pittsburgh. And I would feel like trying to put stuff in, and I was trying to figure out, like if somebody came to me and said, my child got this, and I object. So I stuck with kind of certain authors that are very popular, and Caldecott was always, if I could get a Caldecott book. So, I understand the kind of razor's edge that people try to walk, but I didn't want to put junk in, and I didn't want to put it, and I wanted it to be truly good books. I would have had To Kill a Mockingbird, I bought them at thrift stores. So there was a source that sold books for $1, and that was where I got stuff for the book, for the box. But I remember just the difficulty of wanting to put quality material there and not wanting to deal with neighborhood challenges.
So, I'm sorry, you
No,
were
no, no. There's a couple of things that I didn't talk about. So I do think as a parent, there are books that I didn't let my children read when they were younger because I didn't think they were ready to read them yet, right? I always think James wanted to read the Stephen King book, and I was like, I don't want you waking me up with having nightmares. This is a practical consideration, right?
Right.
That's fine. I just don't think it's okay for you to say, like, no one should ever be able to read this. And then just a word about the quality. Reagan Nathan has I'm going to get this wrong. He's a library founder. To every book its reader and every reader its book. So you talked about junk. I think, I like to read all kinds of books. I told someone one of the books I read was like a junky thriller, but I love reading that kind of stuff sometimes, right? So just because it's not high literature doesn't mean it's not worthy of being read.
So one really neat thing about the little free library, the book box Marty was talking about, is that in addition to us selecting stuff to go in there, other people can put stuff in there too. And that has another dynamic, and it's a bit of a challenge, right? Because it's ours, right? But it's also for the community. And, and so it had to be making sure that whatever was winding up in there was, it's not like we were afraid of legal consequences or anything like that, but still we didn't want to have, things that we found objectionable in
Right.
there, while still allowing for the community to express themselves. What occurred to me when you were just bringing that up, in the context of a public library, it's all provided through the vehicle of, the library as an entity itself. And what if there was a community, the section in a way. Maybe it's not physically separated, but maybe it is, where it's like, we're providing this and the community itself can also help populate the library. And, with some ground rules, right? So, but if they want to fill it up with, political megaphones of one stripe or another, and that's all that gets contributed, then that's all that's there. But it also obviates the requirement of the public library to find any such materials and can therefore focus more on what they'd like to be available to the community, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think you'd be surprised. The public library will collect stuff. They will on both sides. Yeah.
Run the space issues though.
I guess what I'm saying is like if it was explicitly, set aside as this proportion or whatever will be community provided or something like that, then the community gets to represent itself directly in a way, right? And the library's budget ends up being focused on, the balancing out what remains, like maybe shading out part of what it otherwise would have to consider.
My only fear with that is I get lots of gifts. I get lots of gifts at my library, and people also want to
Right.
outdated materials or like, oh, you want my encyclopedias that exist now, and no one wants to. Yeah, it's an interesting idea though.
We got, let's see, Jacob said that when we do the not little free library, but the reading park, this coming spring, that some members of the church are helping out with. He said we should have a banned book day or a week or something like that, where all the books in the boxes are banned.
And so we can
I like
September dedicated to band. It's called Banned Books Week.
Then we should do banned books week for that, yeah. And what else? Holly said, I'm just grateful that my parents encouraged me to read and never put restrictions on what I read. Even though I came from a broken home, I had the tools I needed to be a critical thinker. And Gabe has a counterpoint to that I was constantly told what I could and couldn't read. And as a result, I got curious and read a bunch of shit that was too old for me. And yes, it affected me in some less than desirable ways. I had the same experience, Gabe. But also it broadened my mind in ways I don't regret at all. Case in point, me getting curious about early dystopian fiction after the Hunger Games and reading Brave New World in 1984.
My mother didn't censor what I read. And I grew up in the era where there were like these true confessions magazines, which were considered racy. But my mother told me, I mean, I thought she wasn't a very good mother, but she did this one thing right. She said, yeah, you can read that, but I don't want it on my coffee table. It's trashy. You can read something well written. And I want you to know the difference between trash and what's well written. And so at the age where people were getting obsessed with, harder, like Playboy or whatever, I was past that because it hadn't been made an issue of.
Yeah, I don't know. I read dirty books in grade school, and I think it made me a dirty girl. I was a tart for a time.
One of the things I've thought about just listening to, I think the debate you have to go through as librarians to critically think about what is quality material and what should and shouldn't be represented. Even quality becomes a tough issue. It's just
Subjective.
Well, yeah. Thinking about our children, are we teaching our kids the tools and the literacy that they need to be? I mean, we're just, for example, teaching them history. You know, they'll take a history course, but there's, you know, do we ever teach them to think critically about the sources that materials come from, or you know, to challenge themselves? I mean, it's almost like we try to just program them, but we don't actually teach them to think for themselves unless, you know, they have a luxury of maybe a liberal arts education. Even then, I mean, when I think about our school, I don't think anyone ever pulled me aside and said, hey, you know, what to look for, what to think about, or how to challenge something in your own head.
Agreed.
I think librarians are trying to.
Yeah.
In Ohio, you're not required to have librarians. So,
Wow.
yeah.
I remember this
Yeah.
now. And it just made me sad all over again.
And it's really difficult, especially now. I've had a couple of teachers that tell my kids, like, just go out on the internet. I'm like, let's not just go out on the internet. There's quality stuff on the internet.
I'm in the master's program, master's of divinity. Other master's students are unaware of academic materials, and like we were told to research a topic and then come up with, well, the project was called Review of Reviews. You have an article and whole reviews of it, and they were thinking like New York Times, which the teacher said, well, that's not bad, but then it got to like, how about People Magazine? Well, no, let's not do People Magazine. Why don't you get an academic journal? And they just drew a blank. And so, you know, I would expect by the time you're working on your master's degree, you ought to know what an academic journal is.
That's what your major was.
Maybe you said earlier, but I didn't catch it. What academic library are you?
I work at Ohio Northern University.
Oh, okay.
Where she is the head cheese.
What kind of challenges have you gotten and how have you guys dealt with them?
I have never had a challenge yet. So because all of my students are 18 and over, they're technically adults, right? So no one would bring a challenge. Like I said, most challenges are brought by parents. I know in the past they had a professor that's very religious. They tried to give stuff to the library, and the religion professors weren't happy about the quality of the material. But this was before my time. But other than that, I've never had. And we're not recording on the story. Of a semi-challenge. So it's a great discussion. I hope that encourage you to read a band book because they're all
Right. Read all the books.
What is it? It's Toni Morrison, Beloved. That's a big one that's been.
Everybody should just read all of Toni Morrison.
Right.
And Alice Walker.
I'm taking a womanist theology course next semester.
You know, she coined that phrase, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And it's big. It's a huge topic at MTSL. Womanist theology. Womanist ethics. Oh, actually, mine is womanist ethics.
You can share your materials with me.
All right, can we do our covenant?
Let's do our covenant. You guys at home can unmute if you want. I love how choppy it gets when we do that. Although we couldn't hear them. I think I did something like that. All right.
Love.
It is the spirit of this church and service
service
of love to dwell together in
in
peace,
to seek the truth in
love,
love,
and to
and
help
to
one
help one
another.
another.
This is
This
our
is our
covenant.
covenant.
Yay! Kathleen, that was a great presentation.
About this one. Racism. I could read the adult version, and maybe I can read the adult version.
Well, see you guys too. Holly said thank you.
Doing them?
Yeah, they're all
All of it, yeah.
We had quite a few people at home. Nice. And Pat, glad you were awake, Pat. Gal, so good to see you, friend.
Okay, thank you.
For some reason, I'm not getting you guys on sound. Hold on.
Is that even a thing? It's just built.
Yeah.
That's very
Yeah.
I guess it's just not gonna work for me now. Maybe I don't have the sound up enough. Thank you.
Yeah.